now it's working. I don't know. Why does it do that? But so a great book on the relationship between Ambrose and Augustine is by Gary Wills. Oh, it's on eBay now. All right, doesn't matter really. The Font of Light. And this is a relatively recent book. It was recently discovered in digging up around the cathedral in Milan. They found the font, the big octagonal space where they had an immersion kind of tub where the newly christened baptized people were, and Ambrose baptized St. Augustine in that font. So that's a neat story. But of course, in writing about it, he doesn't just talk about the font, etc. He talks about the process of becoming a Christian, the relationship that Ambrose had with St. Augustine and his mother. His mother was really quite important there. She went with him to Milan, and she was a member of the cathedral. He was kind of secular at the time, because remember, he's working for the emperor. In fact, the emperor, who was a young man, I don't remember his name at the time, but he was in conflict with Ambrose. And the problem was, Ambrose was a follower of Athanasius, in other words, the Nicene Council's conclusion. The emperor was a follower of Arius. So you've got a conflict between the emperor and the bishop, and the emperor wanted to take over the cathedral, and Ambrose and all the parishioners stood there in front of the military, who showed up with, swords, etc., and threatened, as you can imagine, to kick the people out, but it ended up with nobody getting injured or anything, I guess, and the emperor gave up. So Ambrose won, which was kind of interesting. So this is an interesting book. The book that was kind of the official biography of Augustine when I was younger, and probably still is, was by Peter Brown, who didn't just write this, but he wrote lots of other things on the time period. So Peter Brown is a scholar that's kind of significant at the time. However, I'm pretty sure Peter Brown is dead now. I don't know. That's right. I actually have a recent book by him about, I think it's this one. Yes, it is. And he was at least alive when he did that. So that's kind of neat. Okay. So, Augustine. So he's converted by Bishop Ambrose, becomes a Christian, and goes back home to North Africa. Goes to Hippo, I think, and at the time, the Christians there, he was educated, he was smart, so they can kind of force him into becoming a priest. And shortly after becoming a priest, the bishop, who did force him into becoming a priest, because he needed people like that, died himself, and so Augustine became the bishop. And they stayed there the rest of his life until Visigoths came and tried to sack the town, and whether he died because of the Visigoths or he died of natural causes at about that time, that's, I don't know. There is a movie, I mentioned there's a movie, it's a European film about the life of Augustine. It's kind of interesting. Beautifully done. In any case, what happens next is that the rest of his life then, he spends not only being a pastor to Hippo, the town. Oh, by the way, some people get into arguments over whether or not he was black or not, because he was from Africa. Well, his parents were colony, Roman colonists to there. So actually, the whole issue of white, black, what color were they, doesn't really arise until like Darwin. Does that make sense? I mean, so and by the way, from a biological perspective, we don't actually have races. It's a sociological thing. It's more of a social construct. Does that make sense? I mean, we can identify people that we're trained to learn to view people as different, etc. Like if they have pointy ears, we know they're elves. Yes.
Didn't Darwin say a bunch of racist things?
Yes. And it wasn't just his fault. There was also this guy that influenced Darwin.
They didn't take society to account of all that evolution.
Reverend Thomas Malthus came up with a theory that human populations tend to reproduce geometrically. That's the right mathematical concept. But that the stuff we need, the necessities for the population, don't grow that way. And as a result, we go through cycles. And once, so while there's plenty of food and everything, we all grow lots of children. But once we get to the point where we no longer have enough food for everyone, we go through a Malthusian crisis. It's called Malthusian crisis. And the crises could be famine or a disease, running rampant, a plague of some sort, or war. In other words, there's something that we do in order to get the population back down. Once it's back down, then we start to grow again. And then it happens again, right? And so this is Reverend Malthus's theory, so you get into a Malthusian trap, or et cetera, et cetera. And he was an influence on Darwin, because this is kind of an evolutionary theory, actually. And when Darwin read about this, notice that Malthus was before Darwin. In fact, he's contemporary of Darwin's grandfather, who also believed in evolution. So that's fun. And by the way, a lot of people wonder what color was Jesus. And of course, if you're looking at Jesus from the perspective of European artists, you can imagine, yes, everybody's seen all kinds of pictures of Jesus from that perspective, but notice that they're obviously wrong.
Right, because he didn't come from Europe.
He didn't come from Europe. I'm quite proud, actually, to have done my DNA study thingy years ago and gotten the results back. And apart from finding out that my mother's ancestors came from northern, like Norway, and were Sami people, which I think explains why I'm so short and ugly. But besides that,
I thought you said you looked like a fisherman.
But besides that, I also discovered I'm 1.2% Neanderthal. I'm so proud of that. That's just so neat. By the way.
Come a long way.
Pardon?
Come a long way.
Well, at the time I discovered that, they had a Geico commercial that made fun of cavemen. And I could really empathize with the cavemen. That was just wrong. Even a caveman can do it. I'm like, hey. But the neat thing about that, by the way, is if you look up DNA studies about Neanderthals, they were Caucasian with predominantly reddish hair and freckles.
And the cave bear.
Canada clay bear. Yeah. The neat thing about that, of course, is if you think about it, Neanderthals had lived in northern climates for long enough that they had acclimated or changed somewhat.
Or
They
lost the pigment.
They lost the pigment, and they also ended up dealing with salt. There's actually other genetic influences. They gradually disappeared through a result of probably inter mating, and so they declined. It wasn't like they got wiped out or they had fights maybe, but they ended up just declining in the new. But if you're wondering if you're Caucasian, you check your DNA, because apparently the explanation for being Caucasian has nothing to do with coming from the Caucasus Mountains. I never understood that connection. It has instead Neanderthal intermixture. You could be between 1% and 2%, and that seems to be where the Caucasian came in to the people that merged in the north. But it's pretty obvious, yes, that we over time adapt to the climate of the place. So if you're in a place where there's a lot more sun, you need to be darker to protect yourself from the sun. If you're in a colder place, it's kind of interesting because not everybody has gotten lighter, right? A lot of people coming from Asia are still relatively less pale. They still dance the same way, though. So if you're wondering about the various dances and the music with the drums and so on, look at the Faroe Islands and check those folks out, because that's fascinating. Okay, so what color was Jesus? We don't know. What color was St. Augustine? We don't know. But yes, people get upset and whatever. Okay. But so, why is St. Augustine so important? He's converted, he becomes a bishop, and he now engages with his rhetorical skills in writing with other theologians of the day. So you end up with him merging Christian beliefs. And in fact, the beliefs are still under construction, basically, at this point. He's the one that's going to give us what becomes the dogma. And how is that going to happen? He's looking at the scripture, trying to figure out how to interpret things. And so he's also looking at things from an educated perspective of the time, and his educated perspective was Platonist. So he's viewing things as a Platonist and trying to understand how does this narrative of Jesus and his influence on us fit with a Platonic worldview. So it's kind of where Athens meets Jerusalem. If you're familiar with that kind of issue, how does Athens and Jerusalem mix? Because the Jewish traditions were not Platonic. Although remember, Saul, who became Paul, was a trained Greek philosopher, basically, and so he views things through a Platonist picture as well, and so we end up then with some very basic things. He merges Christian beliefs with Neoplatonist philosophy, concludes that God is love, that evil does not exist. Evil is not. Evil doesn't exist. Why? Okay, so of course we're going to interpret Scripture. He goes and he looks at the fall. And the fall is where Adam and Eve And by the way, Augustine treats this as a metaphor. This is a story, you know, and it's an explanation. But so humans have fallen out of grace. And the question, of course, is why is that the case? Well, if you look around nature, what you see is the animals, just as Thomas Hobbes will say, you know, there's no need for religion in other animals, only man has religion. And it ties into our recognition of good and evil. We recognize good and evil in our experiences. By the way, this is not just a Christian story. Notice Pandora's box. It's another Greek story. Pan means all, Dora is the gifts. If you open the box of gifts, you know, from the divine, you get the good and the bad. You don't just get good things, you get also the bad things. In other words, you can't have good without evil. The two things are interrelated, right? And this is the fall. That humans literally have fallen from the grace of the other animals, and we see evil in the world. When we get sick, when we're hungry, when we don't have a nice home, or we don't have a nice car. Well, Augustine wasn't concerned with those. But, you know, all that kind of stuff. We get upset. We want that stuff.
Jealousy.
We want that stuff. And how does he trace it? It's just fascinating. I have a link here that should work, hopefully. That's kind of overwhelming. So this is one particular translator who's put together a page on St. Augustine's Confessions. That's one of his books, and it goes chapter by chapter actually, and so it's quite long. Although at the very end of it, it also goes to letters. And if we go, let me pick. Well, that's from Jerome. I want to go to Jerome.
It was right below it.
It was right below it? So, to Jerome. Okay, this is probably not the one. They have multiple letters back and forth. Who's Jerome?